Hello, I'm DJ Grothe, Vice President for Outreach here at the Center for Inquiry, and this is a conference the Center for Inquiry is putting on called the Future of Naturalism. I'm joined by Professor Randall Dipert from the University of Buffalo. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're going to have a conversation today about naturalism, about the future of naturalism. Let's start off. Please just describe, maybe define for me, scientific naturalism. Is that different than the philosophical naturalism that we're talking about at the conference?
Well, scientific naturalism I take is almost redundant because that's what science studies. It's sort of the theory of nature. So I think what we're doing here at the conference is almost all philosophical naturalism. And that is, I would define that as the effort to bring to philosophy some of the successes and methods of the sciences. So where the sciences have succeeded, particularly in the physical sciences, in producing real genuine knowledge, and in mathematics as well, then the idea is maybe philosophy should be doing something like that.
Do you think philosophical naturalism can discover knowledge about things that science doesn't normally treat in the same ways that science discovers knowledge about?
Yes, yeah, I think that's possible. For one thing, we might be able to figure out some aspects. In my paper, for instance, I argued that science, very deep research in psychology using statistics, might give us a rich theory of well-being, the very notion of well-being or happiness, if you will, and then that is extremely important in all the ethical theories. And it turns out that the empirical results of these surveys correlate pretty well with the same kind of hints about what it is to have a good life that we get from Aristotle and Mill. But it's presumably a richer one because it's founded on real people's experiences and cultural wisdom and so forth.
So there can be a real science of happiness, but it ends up having to say a lot to the whole philosophizing about happiness the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, that's right, because the good life is so important for even many different kinds of ethical theories that the science may help there. The other case I drew out in my paper was my belief that principles of ethical behavior in society are something like equilibria that allow us to get along in the best possible way with the minimum of destruction and maximum well-being for all. And I argue that we could use empirical and even mathematical methods to find out what these equilibria are. And in particular, I gave an example from international relations.
So that's really going at this in the spirit of science, looking at the evidence, weighing, testing, doing it like a scientist, but you're just not treating things that a scientist would in a laboratory with his beakers and test tubes.
No, that's right. I really am trying to take the scientific method and use it where I can. Now, it can't be used every place in philosophy, but I'm not just taking the results of science as we now have them and then plugging them into philosophy to see what we come out. I'm sort of mixing the two.
For our viewers who might be new to the concept of philosophical naturalism as a worldview, maybe you'll take exception to that, but philosophical naturalism as both the way of finding things out that you're talking about and also kind of that it has real important things to say about ethics. For those viewers who are new to it, would you see one way of defining naturalism as the opposite of supernaturalism, or is that too basic?
No, that's actually a good place to start. Maybe the best place to start is back up a few centuries, and there was a movement called natural philosophy. And natural philosophy was some sort of effort to discover the basic principles of the universe.
It's what became science.
Yeah, in fact, that's the subtitle to Newton's Principia. It's Principia of Natural Philosophies, the principles of natural philosophy. But around 1900, American philosophers in particular, John Dewey, Ernst Nagel, and Sidney Hook, all at Columbia, and then into the 20th century, and then Roy Wood Sellers at the University of Michigan founded a movement which is generally called American Naturalism. And one of their starting points was the rejection of supernatural explanation. And it was presumably in the background of their particular views was the Scopes trial and the brewing science-religion debates, which were took on more importance in the United States than in the rest of Western civilization. But they were in that setting. So yes, the anti-supernaturalism, in particular anti-creationism, maybe not anti-creationism so much as not looking at biblical accounts as the scientific explanation of creation.
Nagel, Hooke, Dewey, those philosophers you mentioned were engaged with the public or these public issues of concern in ways that it doesn't appear professional philosophers are today. Let me ask this question two ways. Do you think philosophers by and large today would all consider themselves philosophical naturalists, number one, and number two, those that do, are they as engaged, or do you think they should be engaged more like Dewey, Hooke, others were?
Well, it's said, and it's been said in this conference, that almost all philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition, English-speaking tradition, consider themselves naturalists or admiring of science or respectful of the results of science to some degree.
Yeah, I've heard some scientists say, wow, those philosophers like science even more than scientists do.
Yes, I think maybe we philosophers think more truth comes out of it than the scientists themselves are willing to commit to. But yes, John Dewey was perhaps one of the most significant public intellectuals in American life in the last 2 centuries. There were very few philosophers at all before 1900. Peirce, Charles Peirce, the founder of pragmatism, and William James, and Josiah Royce, those are 3 names. Of those, William James was a bit of a popular philosopher because he was a popular writer and popular lecturer. But he did not engage too much in public issues, except at the end of his life when he wrote a famous paper called The Moral Equivalent of War, which was against what was then the impending circumstances that led to World War I. And Josiah Royce, also in his last years, suddenly turned to the public affairs and came out with a rather unusual proposal for war insurance, to insure nations, and by insuring them they'd have to pay too high premiums if they had large arsenals. But those were just in the last few years of both of those philosophers' lives. John Dewey was
his whole life he was engaged in public issues of concern.
I think
the other part of that question is, do you think philosophers today are they dropping the ball and not being as engaged? They're very academic. It's a career.
Yeah, I think it's part of what you're seeing is the professionalization of philosophy. Naturalism itself hasn't helped because it's made philosophy more full of jargon and techniques from the sciences, which many people find off-putting, especially in a public debate. And yes, they have dropped the ball. There are, especially in the last 20 years, a number of philosophers have come forward and complained and tried themselves to be more public intellectuals. Richard Rorty, Martha Nussbaum, John Locke, John Smith. So there have been people who have called philosophy on this sort of failure to make recommendations directly to a public rather than just talking to each other.
Switching gears a bit, I want to talk to you about some of the implications of the naturalism that you're espousing, that you're promoting, that you've adopted, that you buy into. if naturalism, if one way of starting to wrap your head around what philosophical naturalism is, if one way of doing that is to draw a distinction between supernaturalism, seems to me that there are some really big implications for society, for most people in society whose central beliefs are supernatural beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so. That's one of the major projects of philosophy, is for one thing to convince people that morality and moral principles do not necessarily come from God. First of all, a number of world religions don't have moral gods, or their gods don't give moral directives. Right. It's just the Judeo-Christian tradition where you have a God who's a God who's a lawgiver. Right. So it must be possible to have moral societies and moral people, since all these other cultures, probably most of world cultures, don't have these gods as lawgivers. And then an important part of naturalism, as it's blending into humanism in the 20th century.
Define that for me quickly.
Well, humanism's a lot tougher to define. For one thing, I don't consider myself so close to the humanist movement as I am to the naturalist movement. Mm-hmm. But it is essentially a secular movement to rebuild a good society, not a lawless society, but to rebuild a society with positive values for society and individuals' lives that are based on human, secular principles rather than sacred principles.
Humanism, though, still steeped in naturalism.
Yes.
But that social agenda that you said you're not as close to, humanism at least as a movement, that seems part and parcel to the social agenda of a John Dewey.
Yes, yes. He was one of the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto, and one of the instigators or really causes of it. And the humanist movement has taken on a more formal character. I mean, it's an actual group of people who call themselves humanists with a big H.
It's a movement of people who actually get together on a weekly basis and have their trappings of fellowship, etc.
Actually, I know quite a few people in this movement who are in this building, and I teach philosophy of religion, and I'm more sympathetic to theism and religion than perhaps some of the philosophers around here are.
By sympathetic, you mean?
Well, I've gone to church. I do believe certain things, but I keep my two worlds as separate as I can. But I teach philosophy of religion and this semester ethics. And one of the things people ask me constantly is, well, can't ethics only come from religion? And I said, well, I actually have empirical evidence for that. My relatives and my friends, many of whom are religious, are probably less moral than many of the humanists I know who are all secularists. The secular humanists I know probably give a higher percentage of their income to charitable causes, are more concerned with world affairs in the third world. So I balk at those who would say that religious people are in any sense morally better.
Right, you refute the old canard that if you don't have God, you can't be good.
Yeah.
It seems to me a lot of philosophy has gotten past that, but my original question was about the real-world implications for society. If philosophy has gotten past that, society hasn't. And this maybe gets back to Dewey and his engagement with the public. What's philosophy doing to help society get past that?
Well, I think at the beginning of the 20th century, we would have never guessed that religion would have gone in the direction it did.
Well,
the mainline churches...
They were kind of thinking at the beginning of the 20th century religion would not persist.
Yes.
You know, that humanism, that the religion of man has finally come, it's going to take over, the optimism of the Enlightenment, but that sure didn't play out.
No. And the mainline religions were getting more and more weak on the old-time religion and more homogeneous. They even merged in some cases. And in most cases, their primary agenda became a humanist one of improving the lot of mankind rather than converting or...
there was a social gospel, not to save souls, but to make the world a better place.
And then, for whatever sociological reasons, maybe because religion had gotten too bland, and there were spectacularly successful preachers who realized that there was a niche they could fill, fundamentalism has come roaring back.
And all of those.
Yeah. So whether it's because of superior rhetoric and drama and entertainment value of the fundamentalist religion, or because the secular humanists and the mainline religions who didn't have many rough edges anymore just didn't have enough of an agenda that appealed to people.
Or didn't do it well enough.
No,
there's
that's right.
There's kind of it's not rocket science on how to build a movement, but the secular humanists, the Deweyites, the signers, and the people who bought into the original Humanist Manifesto, they didn't really, it seemed like their ideas didn't really get traction in the ways that other social movements did. Of course, now people are angling to do just that, with the secular humanist movement. I want to switch gears again, Professor, and talk to you about the academy, where philosophical naturalism fits in kind of philosophy as a discipline. Do you think that there are any philosophical systems or movements that are giving naturalism a run for its money right now?
Well, first of all, I was momentarily startled when you said the academy, because I taught for 5 years at West Point, and everyone refers to it there as the academy. Yeah. So I thought, why is he asking me about the military academy?
Drop and give me 20.
Yeah, I have various conceptions of the academy, some of which I'm hostile to the academy. Partly, for instance, for the lack of social engagement in the world. I happen to be modestly engaged. I read the New York Times every day. I've always read the journals of opinion.
But is that what you mean by engagement?
That's the mildest form. That's a passive engagement.
But I imagine a lot of professors read the New York Times. When we're talking engagement...
you'd be surprised how few follow political events in any detail.
Right. Because they're poring over the latest journal.
Or they just have a perspective on everything and they take it toward everything, and they like certain things they hear and not others. But in terms of actually going out and working and doing something, that's a bit of a problem too. I don't think many people in the academy are out there working for Habitat Humanity, and that I don't hear of that.
Right.
I myself have had some vague ideas to teach mathematics in inner city schools or something like that, and maybe I'll do that some sabbatical or in my retirement, but I have not heard much in the way of social engagement. There's one exception in my own department. There's a professor who has essentially become a goodwill missionary to Bolivia. He was a Quaker, and
that'll do it.
Yeah, and he regularly goes there and takes antibiotics and sees a particular tribe and helps particular people with agriculture, oddly enough. I don't see myself helping with agriculture ever, but but I could do something, probably should.
The question was about any movements within philosophy that are giving naturalism a run for its money in the academy. You mentioned one beef you have with the academy is the lack of social engagement, but are there any other look, 30 years ago, philosophy departments, I'm told, were kind of all naturalist, or materialist or something,
Yes.
non-supernaturalist, whatever else they were, they weren't supernaturalists. And now there are a lot of philosophers who are bringing to bear their Christianity, their theology within the discipline of philosophy, and not just at Catholic universities. There are philosophical theologians everywhere. Are there any other movements besides the obvious that I just mentioned that are giving naturalism a run for its money?
Yes, there's sort of one minor movement and one more major movement. The minor movement is some energizing against the reduction of mental states or even cultural entities to physical phenomena, because we haven't found yet the laws, and some people think we will never find the laws that exactly relate mental phenomena to physical phenomena or cultural and societal phenomena. That's a return of dualism, but that's the most mild-mannered. It's a subtle point in the relationship between mind and matter, rather than being any real threat to naturalism. Not only that, but those who hold it say that all that means is that there can be a separate science of mind, and we'll try to do that scientifically too. The other movement is a kind of rebirth of a movement that was active in the 18th century, and that is natural religion, essentially trying to make religion philosophically sensible and try to get good arguments, try to avoid the revelation authority method of promulgation, and instead to come up with good philosophical arguments for certain points in religion.
And you see that in philosophy of religion
Yes.
specifically?
Well, it's throughout philosophy now. Alvin Planning is a particularly important name, but he's such a good philosopher in many other respects, quite independently of his religious views, that he's taken seriously. And there's a whole...
Do you think that gives him a pass when he talks about these more theological questions? Or is he doing that with the same rigor and philosophical oomph?
Well, he's sectarian, but there's a Society for Christian Philosophers, for example, and I don't know when it was founded, 15 or 20 years ago, and that meets in conjunction with our regular Philosophy Association. And I've gone there occasionally. I'm interested in technical details of arguments for and against God. So I go to those meetings, and they are conducted at a very high professional level, which means sort of very low religious content in a way, because there's not much real faith.
You've stripped out all the content of religion. You just have the bare bones.
Yes.
That someone who still believes but doesn't believe all the supernatural claims, so it could still sink its teeth.
Yeah, I used to think, and I told my students this all the time, and I think it was told to me by one of my teachers, and that is that there's a lot of philosophy of religion that's just philosophy of God. God stripped of his worst features, and there is no philosophy of Christianity, in spite of no special philosophical development of Christianity. That's no longer quite true. There are sophisticated efforts to worry about the Trinity, as there were in the Middle Ages. But by and large, philosophy of religion is about, you could almost call it an Aristotelian prime mover or something like that.
Right. We began our discussion talking about definitions of philosophical naturalism, and you contrasted and compared it to science in general, and talked about science's influence on philosophical naturalism. Are there any developments within any of the sciences, I'm thinking maybe cognitive neuroscience, any of the sciences, that are changing philosophical naturalism, or making people rethink some of the basic ways of going about the philosophical naturalism project?
Yes, there are some big changes. I was originally a physics major, and I was trained in the history and philosophy of the physical sciences, physics and astronomy in particular. That has rapidly, and most of the people of my generation and before in the 20th century, we're all experts on the philosophy of physics. But that now is almost old-fashioned. Instead, there's neurophilosophy and philosophy of biology. Those are the really interesting areas.
And are they bringing to bear their insights?
Yeah, they have distinctive issues, some very interesting issues that have not been solved. With, of course, the biological issues come all these ethical issues surrounding cloning and fetal tissue and so forth.
And evolutionary psychology raises questions about some of these central assumptions of scientific naturalism. Philosophical naturalism, pardon.
And cognitive neuroscience has raised similar issues about the exact nature of mind and advanced the hypothesis that maybe there really are physical and chemical explanations for most mental phenomena.
Do you think most philosophical naturalists buy into that claim? I mean, do most philosophical naturalists, do you hunch most of them believe that the mind is just what the brain does?
Yes, I'd say so.
Most?
I'd say so.
What about you?
Well, I am as well. I think there are a lot we don't understand, and then I think there are philosophers and even scientists who pretend that they think they know what that reduction is. But yeah, if I had to take a hunch, I would say it will progress just like chemistry did until you could get down to a bottom level and be able to trace it to the behavior of atoms. It's going to be a very, very complex phenomena, and there may be issues of complexity that are so daunting that there are somewhat mysterious features that are hard for a single mind to grasp. When you have billions of neurons connected in complicated ways, it may not be that you have simple explanations for what a thought is.
Right. But there could still be explanations.
There are. They just may have to be sort of computer calculated or even computer discovered.
As we're nearing finishing up, I want to ask you, as a professional philosopher in the academy, not just at this point, are there currently any major problems in the field of philosophical naturalism that everyone's zeroed in on? Like any big doozy that people are saying, that's the project that I'm going to spend my career figuring out?
Sort of any big problem that people identify as a question in the profession? No, I don't think so.
So they've all been asked, and there's kind of consensus about the answers.
Yeah, the only exception may be in philosophy of biology and philosophy of medicine. There are many difficulties remaining about what an organism is and what it is for various parts of our body to function in a certain way. So the functionality of organs and organ systems and organisms, all of that maybe still needs to be worked out. And there isn't a really good philosophical account of what those concepts are.
But to me, that doesn't seem to be part of the project of philosophical naturalism, as opposed to this discipline called philosophy of biology.
No, that's probably true. Okay. That's probably true. There are no doubts that the body is physical. So,
last question, Professor. The title of the conference is "The Future of Naturalism." Is it rosy?
Well, it certainly looks as if it's dominant, and there's no reason to think it won't remain so.
You mean as a school in philosophy?
Yeah.
What about its impact, a la Dewey, on the real world of people getting up early in the morning to go to work and having kids and keeping their jobs and all that kind of stuff?
Well, my thought is, until it tries to engage the moral and social world more vigorously, rather than just the neurophysiological or the atomic in my case, that it just doesn't have that much value for the public. But if we do push, this was one of the points of the paper I gave, is that we should push in these directions which have real moral and social implications, and then it's worthwhile as a public philosophy, as it was for Dewey. Dewey's had philosophical views that were around social and moral issues, and they naturally were of interest then to a public, whereas certain of our technical issues in philosophy would never interest the public, and probably shouldn't.
Dewey's interests, his social interests coming out of his naturalism, well, he did something about them, and in your paper, and now you've argued, you guys need to do the same.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.